Before we begin, I just want to let you know that my other channel, Somewhere Sinister, is back up and running. I've got Season 4 complete and I'm working on Season 5, so the channel should be up and going for quite a while now. There's a link in the description. Check it out. Chocolate. Not usually something that people expect to hear me talk about on this channel, but it's relevant to this case. People know that some of the best chocolate in the world comes from Switzerland, and one of the world's most well-known chocolate makers is Lindt. So popular have they become that they've opened hundreds of chocolate-themed cafes all over the world, and while many people frequent the cafes to sip a hot beverage and enjoy some world-class chocolate, in Sydney, Australia, the location would become the scene of unspeakable horrors. This is Monsters. Man Haron Monis was born on May 29, 1964 in Bourjard, Iran. He was originally born with his father's name, Mohammed Hassan Mantaki, but would go by a number of other names throughout his life. Man Haron Monis would become the one that was most well known. He was the sixth and youngest child and the only boy. It's believed he was treated differently as a baby and the only son, which would see him grow up with a sense of entitlement. Man's father died when he was only a teenager, and that was followed by an extreme shift in the Iranian government. The country had been ruled by a monarchy for centuries and had more freedoms in place than most people today would expect from the conservative country. Looking at pictures from the 1960s, you'll see people wearing fashionable clothes and women on the beach in bikinis. The country's youth could be seen doing the Tehran twist to rock and roll music. In 1979, the monarchy was replaced with an Islamic theocracy, and all laws were then changed to meet the criteria of the Islamic religion. That sought to severely restrict how many people, especially women, were allowed to dress and act. In 1985, Man married a woman named Zahara Mobasheri, who he had met at university. Her father had close links with the ruling regime, which helped place Man in a higher social circle than he had been before. The couple ended up having 2 daughters while Man was attending a theological academy with the intention of becoming a Shiite cleric. He worked his way up the ranks and used his position to start operating a number of businesses that were not entirely legitimate. He resold government textiles for a while, then he started operating a travel agency that specialized in obtaining visas for wealthy Iranians. Then, on October 1, 1996, Man showed up at the Australian embassy in Tehran claiming to be the legal consultant to a maritime engineering company who needed to travel to Australia for business. He had managed to reel in Australia's Trade and Investment Commission, who backed up his story, so the embassy approved his request and Man flew to Sydney on October 28th. He would never return to Iran and would never see his wife or children again. After he arrived in Australia, Man changed his story and told officials that he was in the carpet trading business. Then he told the authorities in Australia that he had secretly been working for the CIA and that he needed political asylum. He claimed that he had met with CIA agents in multiple places throughout the world and that his wife and daughters had been arrested once he had fled. At first, the Immigration Department had Man's story checked out with the Australian Security Intelligence Organisation, an organization that checked on spy stories like this, and they initially said they were skeptical. But upon a second review, they approved his case and Man was given political asylum in August of 2000. The truth was, Man had stolen $200,000 from people through the travel agency and he had a warrant out for his arrest. He was also under investigation in Iran for sexual assault, so he had fled the country. His wife and children were not being detained. In fact, Zahara was doing well working as a university official. Iranian authorities put out an Interpol alert for Man in 2001, but since there was no extradition agreement between the two countries, Man was not sent back. He told the Australian authorities that he had been blackmailed into spying on the regime's rivals, a story that would gradually change over time. Mann found a job as a security guard in a shopping center after training and being certified to use a revolver and a semi-automatic pistol. He found an apartment where he rented one of the rooms out. His roommate said he was extremely paranoid. There were no visitors allowed and he wouldn't answer the door for anyone. A year later, he moved to Perth and began working at a Persian rug gallery. For the first few years of Mann's time in Australia, he got by well and didn't seem to raise many alarms, but it seemed that Mann was not one to live outside of the spotlight. In November of 2000, Mann chained himself to a pole in front of the Parliament House and staged a hunger strike. He said he was protesting the Iranian regime. He was only there for a few hours before someone called authorities and they removed him from the property. About a month later, he was fired and had to be removed from his workplace by security. After that, he ended up back in Sydney. Soon after his return, he chained himself to a fence outside of the New South Wales Parliament. He demanded that the Prime Minister contact Tehran and pressure them to release his family. You know, the one that wasn't really detained. As Mann began a pattern of being a nuisance to the local authorities, he also changed his name to Michael Hasan Mavros and started advertising his services as a spiritual healer. He targeted ads to vulnerable women and told them he could help them find love, predict their future, or ward off evil spirits. Not only did that scam start bringing in quite a bit of money, but he was able to use it to obtain sexual gratification from vulnerable women. One woman started using his services in 2003 after escaping an abusive relationship. Eventually, Mann told her that she had a sexual curse which could only be lifted if she had sex with someone. That led to Mann forcing himself upon the woman right then on his massage table. Another woman was seeing him when he told her she also had a curse, and this time he said she needed to abstain from sex for a week. When she returned for her next session, he claimed that she had cervical cancer which had been put there with black magic. Conveniently, the cancer could only be cured with his sexual energy. He then forced her to lay on a bed where he sexually assaulted her. Then he told her he would curse her with black magic if she told anyone. In 2002, Mann met a 20-year-old student at the University of Western Sydney named Nolene Pal. Of course, he told her he was Michael Hasan Mavros and claimed to be of Egyptian and Greek ancestry. They had a wedding ceremony in 2003, but it wasn't legally registered. Nolene had their first child together in the middle of 2004. Mann was not interested in being a father and provided no support financially, emotionally, or physically. It was in 2004 that he began using the name Haron Monis. Despite the posting from Interpol, Mann was deemed credible and was given Australian citizenship that year. Mann and Nolene continued their relationship, though it seems they didn't live together full-time. In 2007, she had their second child, and it was then that she learned the truth about her so-called husband. Well, at least it was closer to the truth than what she had originally believed. He told her that he was from Iran and that he worked as a spy, which is why he had fled the country. Then he told her that he wanted to start a website to teach people about the Islamic faith. After that, Mann completely changed. He grew a beard, started praying 5 times a day, stopped drinking alcohol, and became much more strict with his family. He tried to force Nolene to wear Islamic clothing and wouldn't allow his sons to see non-Islamic friends. Mann's behavior started raising red flags, and in 2009, the Counter-Terrorism Division arrived at Nolene's house with some questions. They told her they were investigating Sheikh Haron, something she had never heard her husband be called before. They took some digital devices from her home and also told her about Mann's other family back in Iran. Then they warned her to get away from him, unfortunately advice that she would wait too long to follow. What Nolene didn't know was that Mann's website was filled with videos and writings denouncing Western governments. On the site, he said he would counter President Bush's war on terror with his own war on oppression. In March of 2009, Mann claimed that the Black Saturday bushfires that had claimed 173 lives were divine punishment for Australia's involvement in wars throughout the Middle East. Mann had also been seeing a new woman, Anastasia Droudis, even proposing to her at the end of 2008. By then, Anastasia had converted to Islam and she had changed her name to Amira. She would end up appearing in 11 of Mann's videos on his website, where in one she praised the people responsible for the September 11th attacks in the US. In another video, she expressed approval for Jews being killed during the Holocaust. Everything that she said online had been scripted by Mann. Even with his increasingly volatile messages, the authorities didn't mark Mann as a threat. After their investigation revealed that he had almost no followers, the local authorities as well as the anti-terrorism division saw him as someone who could become a threat in the future but wasn't in immediate danger. In 2010, Mann and Amira had begun a letter-writing campaign to family members of fallen Australian soldiers who had served in Afghanistan. In the letters, he wrote that the dead relatives were murderers and were burning in hell. He was charged with 12 counts of using a postal or similar service to menace, harass, or cause offense. Amira was charged with 8 counts. Mann pleaded guilty and was sentenced to probation and 300 hours of community service. Amira received a 2-year suspended sentence. In 2011, Nolene was ready to end things with Mann for good, but he wasn't gonna have it. He wanted access to his sons, Nolene believed, so that he could turn them into extremists. He was so aggressive about seeing his children that he threatened to shoot Nolene if she didn't let him see them more. Nolene reported the threat to the police and he was charged with stalking or intimidation intended to cause fear or physical or mental harm. In May of 2010, he was found not guilty in court. Over the next few years, Nolene managed to share custody of her sons with her violent and increasingly unstable ex. On April 21, 2013, when Nolene arrived at Mann's apartment to pick her children up from a scheduled visit, she was attacked by a woman wearing a cloak. Neighbors heard the screams, and they saw Nolene being stabbed before the masked attacker poured fuel on her and lit her on fire. Then the attacker fled. Nolene had been stabbed 13 times before being set ablaze, and she did not survive. When police informed Mann of her death, he pretended to be surprised and suggested her own father was likely the killer, but it didn't take long for an investigation to uncover the truth. That day, Nolene had dropped the boys off with their father in the morning, and then he took them to a community pool to go swimming. He conveniently brought a video camera with him and recorded the entire trip, making sure to turn the camera on himself throughout the day. He also managed to get shots of various clocks so that the time could be confirmed throughout the video. Since Mann and now his girlfriend were increasing their violent rhetoric online, the authorities had begun watching them again as possible threats. That meant the couple had been under surveillance while they were planning the murder. Mann and Amira had been recorded discussing ways to keep suspicion off themselves after the murder. Investigators also discovered that Mann had taken out a $150,000 insurance policy on his apartment 11 days before the murder. They believed it was in case the fire spread to the building after Nolene was burned. In November of 2013, both Mann and Amira were arrested. Amira was charged with murder and Mann was charged as an accessory. Despite being on probation, Mann was still allowed to be released on bail. While he was out, the multiple counts of sexual assault that had been reported by his many victims over the years were finally starting to be taken seriously. He was charged with the first sexual assault count in April of 2014 and would eventually be facing 40 counts. Mann was also completely out of money as he had been living off of education grants, having signed up and dropped out of classes in a scheme to acquire the funds. But the system had caught on and his payments were halted. Haron Monis was a violent and mentally unstable man on a downward spiral that would not end well. For the rest of 2014, Mann's radical behavior would go into overdrive. In September, he attended a protest against a counter-terrorism operation. In November, he created a Twitter account and sent 157 tweets in 8 days. The tweets were often links to graphic images of dead children in Middle Eastern war zones. He also posted on his website pledging allegiance to the Islamic State Caliphate. At the beginning of December, the Australian Security Intelligence Organisation re-evaluated Mann's position and still determined him to be not an immediate threat. That would end up being one of the worst determinations they could have made, because just 2 weeks later, Mann would carry out his final protest, which would come with deadly consequences. On December 13th, Mann pulled all of his money out of the bank, an estimated $850. Then he went to a sporting goods store and bought a Camel Mountain backpack. The next day, Mann went to the local police station to report for bail, and then he was seen outside of Amira's parents' home. 34-year-old Tori Johnson was the manager of the Lindt Chocolate Cafe in Sydney. Lindt Chocolate is a Swiss company that was founded in 1845. They have opened 410 cafes throughout the world, and on the morning of December 15, 2014, Tori had arrived early to open the store like he had so many times before. Tori was born on June 26, 1980, and grew up in South Maroota, just northwest of Sydney. His parents fostered his creativity, and growing up, he had a strong interest in cooking, fashion, and architecture. After high school, Tori attended the International College of Management's hospitality program on the peninsula of North Head. He ended up transferring to the International School of Management's branch in Switzerland, where he met his partner Thomas Zinn. After returning to Australia, Tori managed a large restaurant in Sydney Harbour, but didn't like the long hours. That's when he got the job managing the Lindt Cafe. About 30 minutes after Tori got to work, the barista, 30-year-old Harriet Denny, arrived and made coffee for her and her supervisor. Not long after that, 35-year-old Paolo Vassallo arrived and went to the kitchen where he began preparing for the day. It was the holiday season, so the cafe was staffed well for the influx of customers. Outside of the 3 full-time employees that had already arrived, there were 5 part-time employees there that day. The first 2 to arrive were Gerard Hoffman and Fiona Ma, both 19. The other 3 employees that arrived at the cafe later that morning were 20-year-old Yoon Bae, who went by April, and Joel Harad and Ellie Chen, both 22. Ellie's sister Helen also worked at the cafe, but she wasn't scheduled to work on the 15th. Tori opened the doors at 8 a.m. and it was a busy morning, as was expected. At 8:30, man Haron Monis entered the cafe and ordered a cup of tea. He was the first customer that Fiona served that morning. It was her first week of work, and she was only a temporary employee, having gotten the job through her sister to make some extra money over the holiday break. She lived in Queensland and was staying with her sister in Sydney. Fiona saw that man already had tea, and when she asked him if she could get him anything else, he asked for a piece of velour chocolate cake. A short time later, man used the restroom, and when he came back, he asked Fiona if he could move to a different table at the back of the cafe near the doors that led into the building lobby. The cafe was situated on the first floor of the Overseas Union Bank building. It had 2 sets of doors, one in the front that led out to the street and one in the back that led into the lobby of the building. Fiona said yes to man's request, and he moved his tea, cheesecake, and large backpack to the table. It wasn't long before man got Fiona's attention again and asked her what the manager's name was. After she told him, he asked to speak to Tori. When Tori approached the table, man asked him to sit down, and then he told him that he was taking the cafe hostage and then told him to lock the doors. Tori called Gerard over and quietly instructed him to lock the doors. Once the doors were locked, man reached into his bag and pulled out a sawed-off shotgun. He pulled on a black vest over his shirt and took off the baseball cap that was covering a headband with the words, quote, "We are ready to sacrifice for you, O Muhammad," written in Arabic. The Lindt Cafe was a popular spot even when it wasn't the busy season, so customers were already trying to enter the locked doors. They knocked and peered inside, anxious to get their morning beverage. It wasn't long before would-be customers noticed the man with the gun and started calling emergency services. There were 18 people inside the cafe at the time. Outside of the 8 employees that were there, 10 customers had also been locked inside the cafe with the gunman. The oldest of them all was 82-year-old John O'Brien. He had been a champion tennis player, and despite his age, he was in extremely good shape. He was still ranked in the top 10 of all tennis players in the world over the age of 80. His biggest worry about the situation he was in was whether or not he would make it home to his wife Maureen, who needed his full-time care. 75-year-old Robin Hope and her daughter 52-year-old Louisa Hope had stopped by the cafe for some tea and toast that morning. Louisa had multiple sclerosis, which had been causing her pain for quite a while, but she didn't let it get her down. She had had to stop working years earlier, but she filled her time by volunteering at her church. This was actually not the first time Louisa had been threatened with a gun. Almost 3 decades earlier, she had worked assisting a private detective, and when she approached a troubled father to serve him papers from family court, he pointed a shotgun at her. Somehow, she managed to get him to lower the gun and told him she would come back some other time before running to her car. While they were in the cafe, they had begun chatting with 3 lawyers who worked nearby. The lawyers were 40-year-old Stefan Balatautis, 35-year-old Julie Taylor, and 38-year-old Katrina Dawson. Julie was 18 weeks pregnant with her first child, and not much is known about Stefan as he remained relatively quiet after the ordeal. Katrina came from a highly respected family. Her father was Alexander Dawson Sr., who went by Sandy, and he was the former managing director for Arnott's Biscuits and the president of the Royal Sydney Golf Club. Katrina became an overachiever just like her father and 2 older brothers. At her prep school, she was one of 14 students to get a perfect score on her higher school certificate. After that, she attended Sydney University, where she got a combination arts and law degree. After she graduated, she met and married her husband Paul Smith, and the couple went on to have 3 children together. 43-year-old Marcia McHale was at the cafe with 2 co-workers, Puspendu Ghosh and Viswa Ankareddy, both in their mid-30s. All 3 worked for the same bank in the same building as the Lindt Cafe. Marcia didn't work for that branch specifically. She was an IT specialist who traveled to various branches. But when she was at the Martin Street branch, she and her colleagues always visited the cafe. Marcia had 3 children and she desperately wanted to make it home to them. Puspendu and Viswa worked for this branch and always welcomed a visit from Marcia. There were actually 4 bank employees in the cafe that morning, but 43-year-old Selena Winpay wasn't familiar with the other 3 employees. She was a senior finance manager who had a meeting at 10 o'clock that morning and had gone into the cafe to pick up some gifts for the other senior managers. Man told the 18 hostages to sit along the northern wall of the cafe on a long padded bench. He told the captives that they would not be harmed as long as they did what they were told. He then explained that it was an Islamic State attack on Australia and that he had a bomb. He said that other people he referred to only as his brothers also had bombs and they were punishing the country for being involved in operations against ISIS in Syria and Iraq. At 9:41 a.m., Man ordered Tory to dial emergency services and read them the demands he had written down. The note read, quote, "Australia is under attack by the Islamic State. There are 3 bombs in 3 different locations: Martin Place, Circular Q, and George Street. I want to contact other brothers and ask them not to explode the other 2 bombs, but I can't contact because they don't carry phone with them. They have radio with them. I can say that through ABC radio. The plan is to request Tony Abbott to call them or me and to have a debate while it is broadcast live on ABC National Radio. So that's why they have radio, and the best way to contact them is by my voice message to announce that they should not explode the bombs. They listen to me, anything I tell them. The device placed inside the radios is another way of exploding the bombs." The call lasted 12 minutes, and after Tory read the message, the operator got as much information as she could. The note had many misspellings and grammatical errors. In it, he claimed that there was a bomb at his location, the Lindt Cafe, which was on Martin Street. There was a second bomb on George Street, which was particularly vague since George Street is 3 kilometers or 1.8 miles long. Then he said there was one at Circular Quay, which he wrote as the word circular followed by the letter Q. It's right on the water and has the city's main ferry terminal. Man then positioned some of the hostages to stand in front of the windows, facing out with their hands up on the glass. This served 2 purposes: to create human shields in the event the authorities wanted to try to shoot him, and so the news cameras could get a good view of the victims. The cafe was right across the street from the Channel 7 newsroom, which some people suspect is the reason man chose the location. Otherwise, it seemed like a completely random location with no significance to the message he was claiming to have. Attention seemed like it was of more importance to man than anything else. Man pulled a black Shahada flag out of his bag and had some of the hostages hold it up in the window. On it was written in Arabic, quote, "There is no God but Allah. Muhammad is his messenger." The emergency services operator had relayed the information she had received, and soon surrounding buildings were being evacuated. Against police command, some members of the news crew across the street remained in the building with their camera trained on the cafe. Authorities also started searching for the other 2 bombs, but weren't able to find anything. You probably won't be surprised to learn that there were no bombs. Not even man had a bomb. That was a lie to try and convince the authorities to let him talk to Prime Minister Tony Abbott. When negotiations started, man had Marcia speak on the phone to the negotiator. She explained that the hostage taker, who had never given his name, wanted to debate Prime Minister Tony Abbott live on the radio. The negotiator eventually called back and informed Marcia that the Prime Minister was too busy. Marcia exploded at the man on the other end of the line. She yelled, quote, "I don't care what he is doing right now. I'm sure there's nothing more important happening in Australia than the lives of the people in this cafe." After that, authorities were very slow to communicate with the hostage taker. The staff and customers inside would later say they felt like the authorities were just waiting for man to kill someone so they could justify storming the building. Hours passed, and the hostages would later say that man was very unpredictable. He would be nice to them one minute, giving them water and letting them take bathroom breaks, then would treat them terribly the next. He repeatedly told them that their deaths would not be his fault. If any of them died, their blood would be on the Prime Minister's hands. In the afternoon, man ordered Gerard to call a local radio station and ask to be put on the air. The radio host consulted the authorities first, and they instructed him not to allow any of the hostages or the gunmen on the air. Soon the host came back and told his listeners that he had spoken to one of the hostages and that he was not going to put them on. He said he had told them that it would not be in either of their best interest for him to allow him airtime. Then he gave a message specifically to man where he said, quote, "I would appeal to the people or person holding these hostages. These are people that have nothing to do with what you are arguing or talking about. Mate, you've made your point. Let the people go and come out." But that radio broadcast would end up having an interesting effect on the situation. Since man was trying to get on the air, he had turned on the radio in the cafe and was listening to the broadcast. Someone had emailed the host explaining that the flag that man was having the hostages display in the window was not the Islamic State flag, but the Shahada flag, which is a flag with an inscription in Arabic, but they aren't the same thing. There are quite a few different Islamic flags, and people regularly get them mixed up, and it seems that man was one of those people. That caused him to add another item to his list of demands, and that was for authorities to bring him an IS flag. After that, Gerard contacted the police and told them that man had agreed to release one hostage in return for an IS flag and 2 hostages for a media broadcast saying that it was an IS attack on the cafe. Those demands would be brought up multiple times but never met. It led to man becoming increasingly frustrated, ranting that the media and government were all lying to everyone. That went on for hours. By mid-afternoon, John had been eyeing a green button by the main entrance that was an emergency release for the doors. He told man that he needed to use the restroom, and since the gunman was having Fiona escort hostages to the restroom and back, he used the opportunity to ask her if the button worked. Unfortunately, she had only worked there for a week and didn't know. He decided it was worth the risk and began gradually inching himself closer to the button. He had been standing next to Stefan, and the two quietly nodded each other's approval. At 3:37 p.m., John lunged for the door, hit the button, and the 2 men ran out the doors. At the same time, Paolo had been considering running out the fire door back past the kitchen, so when he saw the other 2 men run, he made a break for it too. Police and tactical gear were stunned when 2 men ran out of the building, and then a third burst out of the fire door. Paulo was pulled to safety by one officer, but he was surprised when nothing else happened. None of the officers entered the building. Paulo begged them to go in and save everyone, but they were not given permission to enter as authorities still believed there was a bomb. The 3 escapees were ushered off to be questioned. Paulo told the team that he didn't believe there was a bomb in Mann's backpack. Over the hours they had been confined with the gunman, many of the hostages had come to the realization that he was working alone and there were no bombs. They witnessed him move the backpack around roughly and even use it as a pillow, something they didn't think he would do if there was a bomb in there. The leaders of the operation didn't believe Paulo's assessment was credible, and an on-site psychologist determined that due to the stress of the situation, Paulo was babbling. Back inside the cafe, Mann was enraged by the escape. He started yelling that the police had helped the hostages out and that he needed to kill someone. He grabbed Louisa and put the shotgun in her back, but Gerard yelled out that the 3 men had escaped on their own. The hostages were able to convince Mann that the men had got out on their own and that there had been no police intervention. He eventually calmed down and told the remaining captives that if anyone else ran, he would kill someone. But that didn't stop 2 more hostages from making a break for it. After the first escape, when Mann flew off the handle, many of the hostages hit the floor and took cover. Both April and Ellie were still on the ground and were out of Mann's sight. Over time, Mann's attention had been so focused on other things that it seemed he had forgotten about both of the women. April was able to unlock the doors on the other side of the cafe that went into the building lobby, and at just before 5 p.m., both women were able to escape without the gunman noticing. They made it outside to the tactical officers and then into the command center to be questioned. That evening, 40 Muslim organizations from all over Australia issued a statement condemning the attack. They said, quote, "We reject any attempt to take the innocent life of any human beings or to instill fear and terror into their hearts. Any such despicable act only serves to play into the agendas of those who seek to destroy the goodwill of the people of Australia and to further damage the religion of Islam." Over the course of the evening, police had become more and more organized, having not even recorded the list of Mann's demands. They hadn't even put up a simple whiteboard in the area they were using as a command center to keep information available. There were many times that one of the hostages would try to make contact and nobody would answer the phone. Some family members tried to deliver text messages they had received from their captive loved ones, but none of the officers seemed interested in them. The Counterterrorism Division was also still telling them that they didn't believe that Mann was likely to harm any of the hostages. At 8:38 p.m., Marcia was forced to call the police and tell them to turn off the Christmas lights in the area. Mann didn't want the street lights off because he wanted to be able to see if anyone was approaching the cafe, just the blue festival lights. This should have been an easy demand to meet. It wasn't political or ridiculous. They could have simply turned off the lights. Instead, it went through a complex string of bureaucracy that ultimately led to the lights never being turned off. A team was set up to go out and turn them off upon approval, but that approval never came, so the team was sent home. At 10:30 p.m., Mann's apartment was searched, and after 2 hours, nothing of value was found. The investigators informed the negotiators that they had found no bomb-making material, but that information was never relayed to the tactical team. Mann started complaining that the Christmas lights hadn't been turned off, and he told Marcia to call the negotiators. Between 12:30 and 1 a.m., Marcia tried to call the negotiators 4 separate times, but they never answered any of the calls. She then called the emergency services line and told them that the lights had to be turned off or else the hostage taker would shoot her. By that time, the hostages were able to communicate with their families because Mann was letting them use their phones to post his message to social media. At 1:43 a.m., Tori texted his family and said that Mann was getting more agitated. That would be the last time they would hear from him. A number of the hostages had known about April and Ellie's escape and knew that the door into the lobby was unlocked. Some of them had started gathering near the door, and just after 2 a.m., Gerard pushed open the glass doors and ran into the building's lobby. He was followed by Joel, who grabbed Harriet's hand and pulled her with him. Then Viswa, Puspendu, and Julie. As they ran out, a glass was knocked to the ground, shattering and alerting Man to what was happening. He ran toward them and fired his shotgun, hitting the doors and shattering the glass. Members of the tactical team heard the shot and prepared to enter the cafe, but 8 minutes passed and they still hadn't gotten the go-ahead. Then they heard another shot. Man had fired into the kitchen and now was reloading his shotgun. Fiona took the opportunity to run out of the cafe while the gunman was reloading, but the other hostages either didn't have time or were too scared. Finally, the team was ordered to breach the cafe, and at the same time, Man ordered Tori to his knees and was pointing the shotgun at the back of his head. A few minutes passed, and then Man pulled the trigger and shot Tori point-blank in the head, killing him instantly. Man was able to reload his gun before the tactical team threw flashbangs into the cafe and stormed the building, quickly shooting and killing him. He was shot once in the head and multiple times throughout his body. Unfortunately, the violent end to the siege would leave 1 more person dead and 4 more injured. Katrina had taken 7 pieces of shrapnel from police bullets. She was rushed to the hospital where she later died from her wounds. Marcia had taken shrapnel to both of her legs, and Louisa had taken shrapnel to the abdomen and had a pretty nasty injury to her foot. Both of the women recovered from their wounds. Robin was treated for minor injuries. An officer that made entry into the cafe had been grazed by shrapnel, a relatively minor wound. In the aftermath of the attack, family members created the Katrina Dawson Foundation to provide scholarship to the Women's College, University of Sydney. Amira Drowdies would go on to be convicted of the murder of Nolene Paul. She was sentenced to 44 years in prison with parole eligibility after 33 years. There have been many instances of people radicalized by Islam who have committed horrible acts, and those are always deplorable, but I hesitate to include this attack to that list. I don't believe Man was really working in the name of the Islamic State. He didn't even bring the correct flag with him to the cafe. I think he used that to get more attention. I think that everything Man did was for his own benefit and not for any religious reason. I think he did awful things, and when people found out about them, he wanted to use the media to spin some story about how the evil Western world was setting him up. It was all about his own image and trying to convince people that he wasn't the monster that he really was. Throughout his siege of the Lindt Cafe, he tried over and over again to get people to label his actions as an act from the Islamic State, and he failed. I'm not going to do it for him now. He was a bullshit artist in Iran, he was a bullshit artist in Australia, and he died a bullshit artist. If you're a fan of true crime, hit subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss an episode. You can also hit like or leave us a comment. You can check out our other show, Somewhere Sinister, on YouTube or anywhere that you listen to podcasts. If you'd like to support the show, check out our merchandise at thisismonsters.com. The link is in the description. Thanks again, and be safe.